Welcome to Mega's Wisdom Now. In this presentation, we will get into specifics of the yoga harnessing process, and we will describe how the sacred fire combines with self-observation and the embodiment of the master of being or the inner authority to accelerate sacred inner alchemy toward empowerment and self-actualization. So by specifics, I mean that we will examine the relevant versions of the aphorisms and explain their guidance in terms easily understandable to the modern Westerner inclined toward practices that will transmute the psyche and the embodied experience toward the actualization of human potential. That's what we're after. So to start, we're looking at the 43rd verse of the second chapter that says, "The heat or force of consciousness is an accomplishment of body presence and the senses, and it results from the destruction of impurity. The focus of the inner fire is body awareness and the fivefold windows of the senses. The senses are the windows of the inner being. The misfires that we talked about occur because the fire is situated within the physical frame. That means any kind of imbalance is going to be physically apparent in the nervous system, especially because the nervous system is physical. So it's not just an abstraction of consciousness. When everything goes awry because the fire goes the wrong way or is misapplied, so does our grounded physical experience and the mental activity that depends on it. The fire or force of consciousness that ignites through intention, will, and aspiration literally dissolves the block's chronic tensions and impurities over time. And this allows the senses and the body awareness to rise into greater presence and activation. Now, no process alone of those we described sustains self-actualization in this approach. Everything is interconnected, and the effects are cumulative through the progression of the steps. There are even symptoms one can observe at each step of the way, and these notify the practitioner that they are ready to move on. The impurities this verse mentions, what are they? Well, they're leftovers from the outer mind preparations, because you would think, well, I've become ethical and I've corrected my character and I've repented, so to speak. What you've done with the character reorientation is set yourself up with reference points in the world that do not lead you to further corruption, to further karmic debt, as it were. When you do these things, these character things, corrections, they hone one's character into a fertile ground for further progress. In that way, the shaping of one's ethical stance in life should be seen as something similar to a healthy diet. Now, why? Why is that? Well, let me give the example. We may be addicted to tasty but toxic foods and drinks. We may find changing to a healthier diet a contrived, artificial, and forced thing. We may resist it for that reason. There are those, moreover, in the ethical sense, to go back to our premise, who view ethics as the excuses of the weak, or society looking to limit us and control individual freedom. Who needs it? I mean, it's all relative anyway, right? We're not here to argue all these things. I mean, why should we when we can just throw the philosophical entanglements out the window and take a practical stance and see how that benefits us? As the aphorisms describe, progression of ethical reinforcement of the psyche fosters greater mental health, a stronger mental will, and a clearer sense of discernment. These things are indispensable. A lack or denial of ethical infrastructure is anything but a neutral, let alone beneficial state. Such a lack feeds upon the genuine nature of an individual and eventually corrupts it like a cancer or like a parasite or mold infection or something. One needs to change course then, and this choice, whether it comes through being overwhelmed by crisis or having clarity or even positive events that lead us to a form of illumination, even though temporary, Christianity identifies it through the concept of metanoia. Metanoia or metania in Greek means repentance. It has nothing to do with groveling and begging for forgiveness. It means changing your mind. It's not about changing opinions, it's about changing the whole mental infrastructure. Because you can't fake it. You're going to backslide if you fake it, even a little bit. It requires a recognition, a true recognition that valuing natural morality nourishes the instincts and emotions that are usually blamed for human corruption. And they shouldn't be. Without the higher mind, the lower mind has no choice but to resort to what nature has given it to survive. With the higher mind, however, the pressure is relieved and it can better serve one in life. Modern Greeks have a saying. They say the clever bird is caught by the nose. It means that when we try to take ethical shortcuts and we can outsmart ourselves, we can fall victim to the blind spots that fester in the psyche when the mental infrastructure of healthy consciousness is undermined. Usually this kind of psychological reorientation, coming from metanoia, it's difficult because it is the mental, psychological equivalent of some kind of training. One has to expect that the process is not going to be immediately rewarding because you can't switch at the drop of a hat. You can initiate the switch, and occultism talks about initiation all the time. It's when you step your foot through the door and commit. You still got to do the proverbial work. So looking for the payoff all the time takes us away from the present moment, the now, and it takes us away from our own selves within that moment. As we mentioned in the last discussion, the second part of the sacred fire triad, the force of fire becomes our friend when the mind is supported by healthy and positive principles of engagement and attitude. The result is not immediate emancipation from problems. As I said, things may seem worse as the subconscious resists its own imprinted programming and environmental influences. Now, for this, psychophysical hygiene, the first of the internalizations, helps to keep outer impurities from manifesting and festering. So one can focus on dissolving the inner psychic toxicity and the mental formations that affect the body-mind overtly and through subconscious pathways. And what happens when we actually are somewhat free and have some space? Well, even if we still carry baggage, we're able to see that baggage much clearly because it's all on the inside, whereas when we have the world messing with us, it becomes confused. And our relationships become confused in the sense that they can be corrupting or they can be well-meaning but not beneficial, and we can't really tell the difference and take the action we need to take. But we can still be okay in the moment when we have our psychological infrastructure, even if the moment is troublesome. So okay does not mean anything changes permanently other than that we can breathe, think, and appreciate that life is worth living. Life is good. And not just physically speaking. I mean, it is meaningful. Being is worth nourishing. And positive relationships are worth nurturing, and as opposed to moralistic imperatives forcing limits on those relationships or qualifying them in an absolute manner. In this fundamental process of inner harnessing, we're actually turning up the volume of our own transformation step by step. So by the time the inner fire is applied, our so-called spiritual instinct is awakened enough to engage with it as artfully as needed. So this whole process leading to the inner fire starts dissolving impurities that we have absorbed from the environment, and the fact that we don't absorb new impurities or new corruptions or new programming, if you want to call it that, gives us the space we need to be able to ignite this fire more strongly. And the fire itself, it's a body thing because there's mental fire, as I said, the fire of consciousness, but there's also a deeper body fire that's associated with digestion. And it is still consciousness, but it is the consciousness of the mesenteric or abdominal mind. So when we kind of blend or unite the higher mind with the abdominal mind, and East Asian meditation practices emphasize that kind of thing, focusing on the navel, for example, or within what they call the lower elixir field, the fire can be ignited and then channeled where you need it, usually at the base of the spine or up through the middle pillar, cleaning the meridians or energy channels, etc., etc. So the fire in Western alchemy and in the aphorisms is about burning out things. It's about the process of calcination, but if you leave it at that, that can be very stressful, causing dark nights of the soul, depression, and other symptoms, even in the best of times. And the sutras gladly give us that something else, and this is called self-study or self-observation. Let's see what it really means, or what the deeper nuances are. The 44th verse of the second chapter is translated as, well, the outcome of self-study is the quintessential tutelary deity activation practice. Self-study is the traditional translation of a compound word of three parts. The first part means your own or one's own. The second part refers to context, placement, or minding. And here it refers to the placement of attention. The third part is translated as something incoming or inflowing. It is the whole thing together comes off as one's own brought in presence, one's own brought in attention. So you're actually bringing into yourself your own attention, not just placing attention, but internalizing attention in a volumetric sense. Volumetric means the whole being. So it's the activity of an inflow or reception of your own mental position, your own caring, your own aspiration and context. And with that attention flows the inner flame. So this self-study is a process that depends on turning attention inward in a sustained and mindful manner. So literally, and here's a way to understand it even more clearly. This is self-reflection or one's own mind reflecting itself in itself. When the mind is still, it mirrors the world. It's like the calm surface of the lake mirroring the moon and the stars at night. If the surface of the lake isn't calm, the image is distorted. The mirror of the mind turned on itself reflects an infinite causeway of what the mind is, just like when you have two mirrors facing each other, or an eye looking into itself. It's almost paradoxical to human reasoning, but the effect is a pragmatic experience. I've spoken of mindfulness in a less than flattering manner in previous discussions because I've seen it overemphasized as a standalone passive practice. Mostly it's focused either on external stimuli or thoughts and emotions being expressed passively, not acted upon. It's considered an easier form of meditation, basically, and it does work that way. When you place this dynamic within the progression of internalization, the niyamas that we talked about, and especially when you place it within the fundamental harnessing process of Kriya Yoga, the three last of them, the aphorisms in essence describe that its power can be channeled more potently. You won't have deleterious effects. You won't have negative symptoms. And mindfulness all on its own may be something you can practice over and over again, maybe master, but it may be difficult if the practice is too passive to move to more advanced expressions. So this isn't a passive practice. It cannot be with the fire preceding it. It's not a forced practice either. It's one of attending with care and positive intention to the very fabric of your ability to place attention, which is the field or medium of mind awareness, this ability to place attention. When the mind reflects itself, when you're actually attending to what your consciousness is and how it feels and what is experienced, and then your aspiration nurtures it, the purifying fire opens a space within that allows the internalization to find fertile ground. The infinite mirror effect is neither nebulous nor is it intangible or abstract. The mind makes sense of the world and all that goes on within us, and no two minds are identical. So this is a very organic and active dynamic, and very creative, in fact. So we're not yet in the realm of the transcendent. We're not meditating into enlightenment, but we're in our own bodies, we're in the nervous system, we're not flying outside, we're not ungrounded. Within our inner realm, we clear a space and open the channels so the higher aspects of mind can come to terms with the lower aspects, the instincts and the subconscious. It's in the lower aspects in the subconscious where all the programming is entangled and where we need to just either burn it out or untie its knots. And we do this through the intermediary of our transforming conscious identity. This is why the aphorisms identify the practice as one of embodying one's tutelary deity. The tutelary deity is the beloved deity. It's the one you're most aligned with. It's the one that represents your own ideal self. I wouldn't call it an extension of yourself in religious terms, but you might say in Christian, Judaic, Zoroastrian, even in Islamic terms, we can call it a guardian angel. In New Age terms, it's called the higher self. So it's the mind, the daily aware, it's the aspect of your own consciousness that the daily awareness may glimpse on occasion during a crisis or in exceptional moments of beauty and joy. But normally this lies beyond the field of its reality. This discussion could have been just about how to summon your guardian angel or tutelary deity, but that might get convoluted. Here we want to stick to the pattern of the process itself, the step-by-step unfolding. Now stick around because we're going to get into a more convoluted type and maybe easily misunderstood aspect of internalization. But before we do, let me just say that the practice of self-directed mindfulness is not to be done in isolation on this path. It's to be done in the sequence because the sacred fire, the sacred aspiration, the sacred will is itself transmuted into the sacred aspect of it because the fire may be entangled, your will may be entangled with ego and programming and baggage. So when you bring this kind of mindfulness within the picture, it orients the fire to make a difference. So you are one, or increasingly you become aware of this guardian angel presence or this higher self. However, we need to stay humble in this because the effects are subtle. They're not dramatic and big. That's when somebody's trying to sell you something. In this case, this information is something that you can apply and is very, very down to earth, much more down to earth than you might think. Now, the third and last process of the internalization is dedication to inner authority or surrender to inner authority. This inner authority goes beyond the higher self. And the 45th verse says, dedication to the inner authority leads to the accomplishment of equipoise. This is also the eighth limb. This is the most advanced part of the yoga process. So dedication to the inner authority alone, if you're predisposed, can open you up to enlightenment. You essentially fuse its identity with your own without losing your own identity. It doesn't replace the ego, but it puts it on a fertile ground that will turn it from a program or a set of impulses into a true ensouled personality. That's what enlightenment's all about. It's really the awakening of the soul, because only this true soul, this true identity sense, can link with the transcendent in a harmonized manner. If it's partial, it might cause spiritual crisis. So samadhi is the eighth limb or aspect of harnessing inner potential. There's no English word that encompasses the full meaning of this esoteric concept, but we can come close with an analysis, as I said. So it's distinguished into two parts. The first part, sama, means equanimity. It means balance, the calm lake. This is where people consider, oh, we have to quiet our thoughts. But it basically means quiet the chaos of the mind. You can still be thinking, but the thinking is a deliberate ripple, a harmonized ripple along the surface of the quiet lake. And adi, which we used with the self-study too, means placement, a careful placement. And it also refers to how thought and emotion influence us and what they do. The word is about a perpetual state of inner peace, but it's not being dumbed down or stupefied. What does this eighth limb have to do with the fifth subdivision, though? What does Ishvara have to do with equipoise or any kind of just initiation into the internalization practice? Well, let's emphasize that the steps outlined here are not just sequential, but work in a spiral. The last three parts of internalization encompass the fundamentals of harnessing. Their concentration, meditation, and samadhi as the culmination of meditation. The three internalization dynamics that we're describing here are one octave, and once you master these, you progress into the higher octave, which is the last three limbs. And these three limbs, just like we call the yoga process fundamentals Kriya Yoga with these internalization practices, the last three limbs themselves are also summed up in a single word called basically the summation discipline. In Sanskrit, it's samyama. Now, yama is usually associated with the god of death, but here it refers to the driver of a vehicle or the chariot. Now, the chariot is the fundamental metaphor of yoga. Yoga means to yoke. You yoke the chassis to the horses. You harness the power of the horses, the power of your life force, to the power of consciousness, and mobilize the power of consciousness within the physical vehicle, the chassis of the chariot. And samyama is the quintessential practice that drives that chariot, that brings yoga into actualization. It's part of the harnessing process as a whole, but it also describes the concentrated application practice. This practice, essentially, I'm going to say just a few words about it. This is the cool part where you get to develop powers and abilities. You apply this summation discipline when it actually activates and becomes mastered, so to speak. You can apply it and acquire powers and abilities of the psyche, such as astral projection, clairvoyance, things like that. Being able to manifest reality as you will to varying degrees, etc., etc., and many other things. And your creativity then goes through the roof because you acquire psychic creativity. You actually, oh, I know what to focus on now with this. And strength by strength, you can kind of shape your own development that way, depending on how you choose to practice. So, yoga, however, itself, especially the final chapter of these aphorisms, relates to the culminating state that is irreversible, means that you don't get corrupted once you reach the state, and that's called liberation. And that's another misunderstood thing, and we're not concerned with it. We have our hands full with the basics here. But the yoga tradition emphasizes this liberation at the expense of applications because most people jump into the power aspect. And this can derail into arrogance and internal corruption, which undoes all of the ethical dynamics that we've cultivated, undoes our psychic defense and hygiene. It undoes our well being, it undoes everything. Unless this transmutation of the psyche has reached a certain point. After that, there's really no going back, and you wouldn't want to. Apparently, corruption is still a danger no matter how much you shape your moral compass. So it's understandable, though, given the temptation to apply yoga for worldly power and how you can derail your dynamic when it isn't complete. In other words, the samadhi that we cultivate here is one of deliberation. It's supposed to evolve to a point where it just goes on its own, and you're not in some trance state all the time. We'll talk about that. You'll see why. So, when the inner roots of corruption are left unattended, malignancy can still fester like a disease. It's almost like thinking, oh, I'm done with this illness, so I'll never get it again. I've got immunity now. Well, that's true for some illnesses, but not for others. And and even common cold viruses mutate. So you catch them again and again, in a different form. However, when you enhance your immune system, then there's less of a chance, and in fact, you will not catch a cold. You will be too healthy to catch a cold. This is a state of wholeness that we're seeking. We're embracing both our individuality and the transcendent. We don't need to deny the world in order to open up to our wholeness or a greater being. And we don't need to deny the spiritual, the wholeness, the potentials of consciousness for the sake of worldly fulfillment. Let's get back to the inner fire here and the other two aspects, self-study and devotion or surrender to this primordial consciousness known as Ishvara. These three, when they come together, you move on to the next zone, which is the third limb. And this third limb is called asana, which means stance or seat or posture. Ishvara, however, is very important here because Ishvara is necessary for the right stance. You don't have to awaken it to the point that you've become some divine immortal being or some enlightened being, however the mythologies or the legends or even New Age groups would promote it. This is very humble, this is very natural, this is very organic. It shouldn't be something stressful. And it all culminates with a sense of the sacred, where the fire itself, see, as you move from activating the sacred fire into internalized mindfulness, into using that mindfulness to call upon this inner authority, which is the highest and best and deepest sacred essence of consciousness, comes back to the fire to make it more pure and more and truly sacred. So we're transmuting the fire itself as we go along. And we reach the state with Ishvara where, well, you're also protected here because with Ishvara, just like religious people, oh, my faith protects me. Because they have tuned into this primordial consciousness in some way, even though they do not dare bring it into their sense of self, because that's considered blasphemy. In my opinion, there's misunderstandings about this. And there's also what you might call a religious power structure that doesn't like people to become independent of it. So there's more factors involved. In the yoga tradition, and especially in its iterations made popular in the modern West, usually the stance is associated with physical posture. Hatha yoga is based on the truth of this third limb. And the practices of Hatha yoga, which means the yoga of the sun and the moon, are meant to lead to a constructive synthesis of relaxation and effort. Be completely relaxed, but your effort means to be incredibly intense and committed. That paradoxical balance is part of the artfulness of the inner fire, and it's balanced in that way and results in a natural extension of our former well-being into unwavering joy according to the sutras themselves. This is a functional joy that can range from intense ecstasy and isolated practice to a solid sense of well-being, and that solid sense of well-being is perfectly suited to worldly activity. The limb itself, the limb of posture, is touted to bring about liberation from inner conflict and polarization. At the same time, it's a prerequisite to what is often called energy work. Energy work technically refers to the vital sensations, the feelings that are generated and guided in the body-mind, and beyond it even, through the practice of conscious breathing. We will examine these two limbs, asana and pranayama, the stance and life force manipulation, in other words, along with the fifth limb, the third one of these in this little group, which is mastery of the five senses. And that's kind of another misunderstood practice. And it is an advanced practice, and we haven't gotten even into concentration yet, the first limb of the summation discipline. So that follows mastery of the five senses. And we'll talk about that next time, all of this. And after that, we're going to talk about how we gain all manner of psychic abilities, so people should be interested in that. But for now, there's a lot to ponder, there's a lot to chew, so I'll leave you to digest these little tidbits of information. And without any further ado, please subscribe if you want more of this, if you think this is worthwhile information. If you've gone this far, you probably do. And comment, because there's few of you right now. And I got plenty, and well, whether I have time or not, I can reply to more comments than otherwise would be the case. This is going to get more concise as it goes along because the practices are also, they can't just be glossed over. On that note, let me just say, till next time, Megas out.